The needle was already resting on the metal tray when the puppy pushed its way through the bars of the kennel next door, dragged its small body across the cold tile floor, and lay down directly on top of its dying mother's paw, and in that single, silent moment, 3 grown adults who had seen this room do its work 100 times before finally broke. If you believe in second chances, if you believe that love can stop even the coldest hands from moving, hit like on this video right now, drop a comment below, share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness still wins, and subscribe to Echoes of Dad so you never miss a story like this one. And before you keep watching, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? I read every single one. The town of Millhaven Creek sat in the kind of valley that mapmakers forgot about, a stretch of Ohio farmland where the roads curved around old oak trees instead of cutting through them, where the diner on Main Street still took cash only, and where the county animal shelter operated out of a converted feed warehouse with a leaking roof and a budget that hadn't been increased in 11 years. It was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, and yet somehow, on a gray Tuesday morning in late October, nobody knew that a dog named Willow was about to change the way an entire town thought about mercy. Willow had come to the shelter 4 months earlier, thin as a fence post, her ribs visible beneath a coat the color of wet sand, her belly swollen with a litter she hadn't asked for and couldn't feed. A trucker named Desmond Okafor had found her curled beneath an overpass off Route 9, shivering against the concrete, too weak to run when he approached. He'd wrapped her in his jacket, driven 40 minutes out of his route, and carried her into the shelter himself, refusing to leave until someone promised him she wouldn't be turned away. The intake volunteer, a 19-year-old named Priya Deshmukh who had only been working there 3 weeks, remembered how Willow hadn't made a sound the entire time, not even when the vet tech drew blood, not even when they realized she was carrying 6 puppies inside a body that barely had enough left to carry herself. She gave birth 2 days later in a borrowed whelping box lined with old towels, in a back room that smelled of bleach and dog food, with nothing but a space heater and a volunteer named Odalise Ferreira sitting beside her through the entire night. 5 puppies survived. The 6th, the smallest, a fawn-colored little thing with one ear that never quite stood upright, Willow refused to let out of her sight even for a moment, nudging it back toward her belly every time it wriggled too far, as though she understood, in whatever way a dog understands anything, that this one needed her most. They named him Ash, because of the smudge of gray fur across his back that looked like something had brushed cinders across him at birth. For the first few weeks, the shelter staff let themselves believe in a good outcome. Millhaven Creek wasn't a place with unlimited resources, but it had a compassionate core, a handful of people who showed up every single day not because the pay was good, it wasn't, most of them were volunteers or worked for barely above minimum wage, but because they couldn't stand the thought of not showing up. Odalise, who ran the foster program more or less single-handedly, posted pictures of Willow and her puppies every evening, tagging them with names like Willow's Miracle Litter, and pleading with anyone who would listen to consider fostering, adopting, donating, anything. Priya spent her lunch break sitting on the floor of the puppy room, letting the 5 squirming bodies climb over her legs while Willow watched from a few feet away, her exhaustion slowly softening into something that almost looked like peace. But shelters like the one in Millhaven Creek don't run on hope. They run on space, and money, and time, and Millhaven Creek's shelter had desperately little of all 3. The building had been condemned for renovation twice and denied both times because the county commissioners kept redirecting the funds elsewhere, a new parking structure downtown, a renovation of the courthouse steps, anything that photographed better for a campaign flyer than a dog kennel did. The shelter director, a weary, soft-spoken man named Harlan Voss who had run the place for 19 years, had watched budget after budget get slashed, staff position after staff position go unfilled, until he was left running an operation meant for 40 animals that regularly housed close to 90. By the time the puppies were 8 weeks old, 4 of the 5 had been adopted, a testament to how good Odalise was at her job, and how undeniably lovable a litter of thriving foster puppies could be to families driving through on a Saturday afternoon. But Ash, the runt with the crooked ear, had been passed over again and again. He was smaller than the others, shyer, prone to hiding behind Willow's legs whenever a stranger reached for him instead of bounding forward the way his littermates had. Families would coo over him for a moment and then gravitate toward a bolder, bigger puppy in the next kennel over. And Willow, who had given everything she had to keep 6 lives going on nothing but scraps and desperation. Willow was 7 years old, underweight even after months of care, with a heart murmur the vet had detected during a routine exam and a temperament that, according to the intake paperwork nobody had bothered to verify, listed her breed mix as containing pit bull. That word, on that piece of paper, did more damage to Willow's chances than anything else about her. Millhaven Creek's shelter, like so many underfunded, Overcrowded shelters across the country operated under a policy nobody liked to say out loud but everybody understood: length of stay limits. When space ran critically low, animals who had been there longest, animals with health concerns, animals labeled with breed restrictions that scared off adopters, those were the ones evaluated first for what the paperwork called humane euthanasia due to shelter capacity. It wasn't cruelty. Harlan Voss was not a cruel man. It was the brutal arithmetic of triage, the same kind of math that exhausted, underfunded systems are forced to do everywhere, where the people making the decisions carry the weight of it home with them every single night and still have to come back the next morning and do it again. In the second week of November, a countywide outbreak of kennel cough tore through 3 neighboring shelters, and Millhaven Creek was asked to take in an emergency transfer of 18 dogs from a facility 2 towns over that had been forced to close its doors after a plumbing failure flooded half its kennels. Harlan didn't have room to say no. He never did. But saying yes meant that somewhere in the ledger of who stayed and who didn't, some names were going to move to the top of a list nobody wanted to look at. Willow's name was on that list by Thursday. Odalise found out from a printed schedule taped to the break room corkboard, a single line of black ink between 2 others, and she stood there reading it 3 times before the words fully landed, because in her mind Willow wasn't a line item. Willow was the dog who had learned to press her head against Odalise's palm every morning like she was checking to make sure the same person had come back again, the dog who still, even now, for months after giving birth in a room full of strangers, slept curled protectively around Ash every single night as if the danger she'd escaped under that overpass had never actually ended. Odalise went straight to Harlan's office. She didn't knock. She stood in the doorway with the schedule shaking slightly in her hand and asked him, in a voice that cracked halfway through the sentence, how they could possibly justify this, a dog who had done nothing but survive, whose only crime was a bad set of circumstances and an unlucky line on an intake form. Harlan didn't raise his voice. He rarely did. He told her what he told every volunteer who came to his door with the same question, which was that he agreed with her, that none of it was fair, that he had spent 19 years hating this exact conversation and it never once got easier, but that the shelter had 18 new dogs arriving in less than 72 hours, 4 kennels that needed deep cleaning after a suspected respiratory outbreak, and a euthanasia list that the county vet was legally required to review by Friday morning. He told her that Willow's heart murmur made her a lower priority for the limited veterinary hours they had left that week, that her breed listing meant her adoption odds were statistically near 0 even with more time, and that as much as it broke something in him to say it, the shelter simply could not keep every animal alive on hope alone. Odalise asked for a delay. Just a week. Just long enough to push one more adoption campaign, to call in a favor with the regional rescue network, to try. Harlan looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that carries an entire career's worth of exhaustion behind it, and told her he would try to buy her 48 hours, but he couldn't promise more than that, because the math simply didn't leave room for more. 48 hours became the frame around everything that happened next. That first night, Odalise couldn't bring herself to go home. She told her husband over the phone that she had paperwork to catch up on, which wasn't entirely a lie, but the truth was simpler and harder to explain. She didn't want Willow to spend what might be one of her last nights alone in a kennel without someone nearby who cared whether she was frightened or not. She dragged a folding chair down the row of kennels until it sat directly across from Willow's, and she stayed there for almost 3 hours, talking quietly, telling Willow about nothing in particular, about the weather, about a customer who had come into the feed store where Odalise worked her second job, about anything that might fill the silence with something warm instead of something final. Willow, for her part, lay with her chin resting on her paws and her eyes fixed on Odalise the entire time, occasionally thumping her tail against the concrete floor whenever Odalise's voice softened into something gentler, as if she understood, in whatever way dogs understand these things, that she was not alone in that building even though the hour was late and the halls had gone quiet around them. In the puppy room 2 doors down, Ash slept fitfully that night, waking every hour or so to press himself against the wire mesh separating his kennel from the walkway, whining low in his throat in a way none of the volunteers had heard from him before. Priya, who had stayed late finishing the emergency social media post, noticed it on her way out and paused at his kennel, crouching down to slide 2 fingers through the mesh so he could nose at them. She would say later, after everything that happened, that she wondered if some part of him already knew, not in any way she could explain scientifically, but in the way animals sometimes seem to sense things long before the humans around them catch up. The next morning brought a flurry of activity that none of them had time to process emotionally, because there simply wasn't room for feeling in a schedule that tight. Calls came in from the regional network Dr. Ibarra worked with, though nothing solidified quickly enough. 2 of the 3 interested adopters Harlan had mentioned turned out to live out of state and would have needed at least a week to arrange transport, a week the shelter didn't have to give. The 3rd stopped responding to emails entirely, something that happened more often than anyone in rescue work liked to admit, a burst of good intentions followed by silence when the reality of a heart-murmur dog with a difficult breed listing set in. Odalise refused to let herself feel discouraged out loud, but Priya noticed her checking her phone every few minutes, refreshing the shelter's inbox, willing something, anything, to change the arithmetic before Friday's clock ran out. By Thursday evening, the 18 transfer dogs had arrived from the flooded facility 2 towns over, exhausted, some of them sick, all of them needing space that Millhaven Creek's overcrowded kennels simply did not have. Harlan spent that evening walking the length of the building twice, counting kennels, counting animals, doing the math over and over in his head as though a different answer might appear if he just ran the numbers one more time. It never did. He went home that night, as he had gone home so many nights before in 19 years of this work, carrying a weight that no amount of experience had ever managed to make lighter. Willow spent that final night the way she had spent nearly every night since arriving at the shelter 4 months earlier, curled protectively around Ash in the kennel they had, against ordinary policy, been allowed to share because separating a nursing mother from her last remaining puppy had struck even the most overworked staff member as needlessly cruel. She kept one paw draped loosely over his back the way she always did, and if she understood anything about what the following morning held, she gave no outward sign of it, only the same quiet, patient watchfulness she had carried since the day Desmond Okafor found her shivering under that overpass with a life she hadn't chosen growing inside her and nothing but instinct to guide her through it. Priya heard the news an hour later and immediately began drafting an emergency post, photographing Willow from every angle she could think of, Willow with her head tilted, Willow mid-yawn, Willow nose-to-nose with Ash, who by that point was the only puppy from the litter still waiting for a home. She wrote captions that didn't sound like the polished, hopeful language she usually used. This time she wrote the truth, plainly. This dog has less than 2 days left. This dog gave everything she had to keep her babies alive. This dog deserves better than what circumstance has handed her. Please share this, please, please share this. The post traveled further than anything Priya had ever put online. A local news reporter named Talia Brennan picked it up by that evening, running a short segment on the regional station about the overwhelmed shelter and the mother dog on borrowed time. Comments flooded in from 3 states away, offers to foster, offers to adopt sight unseen, offers of money the shelter desperately needed for its overdue HVAC repairs. For a few hours, it looked like it might actually work, like the current of public attention might be enough to carry Willow across the gap between Thursday and whatever came next. But shares and comments and good intentions move at the speed of the internet, and paperwork moves at the speed of bureaucracy, and by Friday morning, none of the promised adopters had actually arrived, none of the applications had been formally processed, and the county veterinarian, a brisk, overworked woman named Dr. Renata Ibarra who split her time across 4 different shelters and had exactly 1 morning a week free to handle Millhaven Creek's medical caseload, walked through the door at 9 a.m. with a clipboard and a schedule that could not be moved again. Harlan met her in the hallway outside the medical room, his face drawn tight, and told her honestly that there were still 3 interested adopters who hadn't finished their paperwork, that a local news story had gone out, that people were trying. Dr. Ibarra, to her credit, wasn't unmoved. She had been doing this work long enough to carry her own private grief about every name on every list, but she also had 11 other animals to see that morning across 2 other counties, a strict window of availability, and a shelter that legally could not house 18 incoming transfer dogs without freeing capacity first. She told Harlan she could give him until noon. Not a day. Not even the rest of the morning. Until noon. It was 10:40 when they brought Willow into the small back room the staff had quietly started calling, without ever saying it out loud to each other, the quiet room. It wasn't cruel in its design, a stainless steel table, a soft blanket someone had laid across it specifically for these moments, dim lighting instead of the harsh fluorescence used everywhere else in the building, a small speaker in the corner that played low music because someone, years before Harlan's time, had decided that if an animal's life was going to end within these walls, it should at least end gently. Odalise was there, because she refused not to be, because she had promised herself a long time ago that no animal she had cared for would ever face that room without someone who loved them beside them. Priya was there too, having begged Harlan to let her stay even though her voice had been shaking since she walked through the door. Dr. Ibarra stood at the counter, preparing the syringe with the practiced, careful hands of someone who had done this more times than she could count and had never once found a way to make it easy. Willow lay on the table, thinner than she should have been even after 4 months of better meals, her eyes moving slowly between the 3 humans in the room the way she always did, not with fear, exactly, but with the same quiet, searching trust she had carried since the day Desmond Okafor pulled her out from under that overpass. Odalise knelt beside the table and pressed her forehead against Willow's, whispering something none of the others could hear, and Priya stood by the door with both hands pressed over her mouth, and Dr. Ibarra picked up the syringe and took one breath before turning around. That was the exact moment the door, which had been left slightly ajar, pushed open another few inches, and a small fawn-colored shape squeezed through the gap. Nobody had let Ash out of the puppy room. Nobody would have. But in the chaos of the morning, volunteers moving in and out preparing for the incoming transfer dogs, kennel doors being propped for cleaning, staff pulled in 6 directions at once, a latch had been left unlatched, and an 8-week-old puppy with one ear that never stood up quite right had done what he had apparently decided, in whatever wordless way a puppy decides anything, that he needed to do. He had found his mother sent through a hallway full of competing smells, pushed through a door too heavy for him, and dragged his small body across cold tile toward the one steel table in a room full of strangers. Priya saw him first and let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. Odalise turned, and for a moment none of them moved, because what was happening didn't fit into any protocol, any training, any of the careful professional composure they had all built up over years of doing this impossible job. Ash did not bark. He did not whine. He walked the length of the room on unsteady puppy legs, climbed with visible effort onto the low step stool someone had left beside the table, and pressed his small body flat against his mother's front paw, laying his head down against it exactly the way he had every single night since the day he was born, as though the room around him, the steel table, the syringe, the strangers, the low music, simply didn't register as anything other than the place where his mother happened to be. Willow, who had not moved or made a sound through the entire process up to that point, lifted her head for the first time and looked down at her son. And something in her exhausted, thinning body seemed to gather itself, some last reserve of strength, because she shifted her weight just enough to curl her paw slightly around him, the same protective motion she had made every night in the whelping box, the same motion she had made under an overpass with 6 unborn lives depending on her, the same motion, it turned out, that a mother makes without thinking, without calculating, without needing a single reason beyond the fact that the thing she loves is close enough to reach. Dr. Ibarra's hand, holding the syringe, did not move for nearly 30 seconds. Nobody in the room breathed. And when she finally spoke, her voice wasn't the clinical, practiced voice she used to walk families through difficult decisions. It cracked, plainly, openly, the voice of a woman who had spent 15 years training herself not to let this exact kind of moment reach her, and had just failed completely. She set the syringe down on the tray. She said she needed a minute. Then she said she needed to make a phone call. And then, without fully explaining herself, she picked up her phone and walked out of the room, leaving Willow and Ash and Odalise and Priya in a silence that none of them dared to disturb, as if speaking too soon might undo whatever had just shifted. What Dr. Ibarra did in the hallway outside that room, none of them found out until later. She called the Regional Emergency Rescue Coalition she had worked with for over a decade, a loose network of foster-based rescues spread across 3 counties that existed specifically for cases exactly like this, medically complex, behaviorally labeled, out-of-time animals that public shelters could no longer hold but that still had a chance if someone, somewhere, had one open foster spot and a willing heart. She reached a woman named Bettina Kowalczyk, who ran a small home-based rescue out of a converted horse barn 40 minutes away, and who, as it happened, had said goodbye to a long-time foster dog just 3 days earlier and had one kennel space sitting empty, waiting for exactly nothing in particular. Bettina didn't need much convincing. She had seen the news segment the night before. She had, in fact, already filled out an online interest form that had gotten lost somewhere in the shelter's overwhelmed inbox, one of dozens that had come in and not yet been processed. When Dr. Ibarra explained the situation, a mother and son, out of time, a room, a syringe that had already been prepared, Bettina didn't hesitate. She said she was already getting in her car. 40 minutes felt considerably longer than 40 minutes to the 4 people sitting in that small back room, none of whom left, none of whom said much of anything, all of them simply watching Willow rest her chin gently against her son's small body while Ash, exhausted from his improbable journey down the hallway, fell asleep against her paw as though nothing extraordinary had happened at all, as though this was simply where he belonged and had always belonged and would always belong. Regardless of steel tables or syringes or schedules that ran out at noon. When Bettina Kowalczyk walked through the shelter's front doors, dust still on her boots from the barn, she didn't stop to fill out paperwork first. She walked straight back to the quiet room, took one look at the two of them curled together on that table, and said, simply, that she wasn't leaving without them. The paperwork got sorted afterward: foster agreements, medical transfer forms, a quiet, informal understanding between Harlan Voss and Dr. Ibarra that certain administrative timelines could, in extraordinary and rare circumstances, bend without breaking. Nobody in that building ever spoke about how close that morning had come to going differently. They didn't need to. Every person who had been in that room carried it with them from that day forward, the way you carry the memory of watching something almost happen and then, by the thinnest possible margin, not. Willow and Ash went home with Bettina that same afternoon, to a converted horse barn with wide open pasture space and a rotating cast of other foster animals who had, in one way or another, been given a second chance they hadn't been guaranteed. For the first few weeks, Willow was cautious in the way that animals who have learned hard lessons about the world often are, sticking close to walls, watching doorways, keeping Ash within a few feet of her at almost every moment. But slowly, the way healing tends to happen when it's given room to happen at all, she began to soften. She learned the particular sound of Bettina's truck pulling into the gravel drive and would wait by the barn door for it. She learned that the wide pasture behind the barn was safe to run in, and one evening, nearly 2 months after that morning in the quiet room, Bettina watched from the porch as Willow ran, full stride, ears back, tail high, across that pasture with Ash chasing clumsily behind her, both of them catching the last gold light of a late autumn evening, and she said later that it was one of the only times in years of rescue work that she had cried from happiness instead of grief. Odalise and Priya drove out to visit almost every weekend for the first several months, unable to fully believe, even after seeing it with their own eyes, that the dog they had once stood beside in that quiet room was the same dog now barreling toward them across an open field with her son at her heels. Harlan Voss kept a printed photograph of Willow and Ash pinned above his desk from that day forward, not as decoration, but as a reminder, he told anyone who asked, of the exact reason he had never been able to leave this job despite 19 brutal, underfunded, heartbreaking years of it. He said that photograph reminded him that the math didn't always win. That sometimes, against every probability the paperwork suggested, something as small and simple as a puppy dragging himself across a cold floor could be enough to change everything. Willow was formally adopted by Bettina 6 months later, becoming a permanent resident of the barn rather than a foster passing through it, partly because of her heart murmur, which made some adopters hesitant even after everything, and partly because, as Bettina put it plainly to anyone who asked, some dogs simply become the ones you were never going to let go of in the first place. Ash stayed too. Nobody in that barn ever seriously discussed separating them, not once, not for a single day, because everyone who had heard the story of that morning understood, without needing it explained, that whatever bond existed between that mother and her son was not the kind of thing you interrupted. Talia Brennan, the local reporter, returned a year later to film a follow-up segment, and the footage she captured became, quietly, one of the most shared local news clips the station had ever produced, not because of dramatic narration or clever editing, but simply because of a wide, sunlit shot of Willow lying in tall pasture grass with Ash sprawled across her side, both of them completely at peace, completely unaware that they had ever been anything other than exactly where they were supposed to be. If this story moved something in you tonight, if it reminded you that love shows up in the smallest, most unexpected moments, please take a second to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Every single share helps stories like Willow's reach the people who need to hear them most. And before this story ends, I want to ask you something. Somewhere out there tonight, there might be a dog just like Willow, waiting in a shelter, running out of time, hoping someone notices before it's too late. If you've ever adopted a rescue animal, if you've ever fostered, if you've ever been the one who showed up at exactly the right moment for someone or something that needed you, comment below and tell me about it. I want to hear it. I read every single comment, and I promise you, your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read tonight. Years later, Bettina would sometimes tell people who visited the barn about that morning in the quiet room, about a syringe that never got used, about a puppy who somehow understood, in a way none of the adults in that room could fully explain, exactly where he needed to be and exactly what he needed to do when he got there. She would tell them that she didn't believe in miracles in any grand or complicated sense, but that she believed, without any hesitation at all, that love, plain, stubborn, uncalculating love, has a way of arriving exactly when it's needed most, even in rooms built for endings, even on mornings when the clock has nearly run out, even when every piece of paperwork in the building says it shouldn't. Willow lived out the rest of her days in that pasture, growing steadier and stronger with every season that passed, never once losing the habit of curling protectively around her son each night, even long after he had grown far too big to need protecting. And every autumn, when the light turned gold across that field the same way it had on the evening Bettina first watched them run together, someone from Millhaven Creek's shelter would drive out to visit, Odalise, or Priya, or sometimes Harlan himself, just to stand at the fence for a few quiet minutes and watch a mother and her son living a life that, for 40 of the longest minutes anyone in that building had ever lived through, had come agonizingly close to never happening at all. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. If Willow and Ash's journey touched you even a little, please subscribe to Echoes of Dad so you don't miss the next one. There are so many more stories like this one waiting to be told, and every subscriber helps us keep telling them.